Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining this conversation. Thank you to our panelists, to the team at WOLA that has helped us organize this. My name is Laura Dib. I am the Venezuela Program Director at WOLA. And we're having today this event called Violence, Security, and the Search for Justice in Venezuela, where we will be presenting the book, The Paradox of Violence in Venezuela, Revolution, Crime, and Policing During Chavismo, which I have here, which is authored by David Smilde, Verónica Zubillaga, and Rebecca Hanson, who are here with us today in person, which is great. And the book explains the rise of violence in Venezuela under both Hugo Chávez and Nicolás Maduro, and all the factors that have played a role in this. And we will have a presentation by our panelists. So I will just make a quick presentation and explain a little bit the methodology of this event, and then we can pass on for the panelists to speak. So we have Verónica Zubillaga, who is a Venezuelan sociologist. She's a professor at the Universidad Simón Bolívar in Caracas. And currently she's a thinker, visiting professor at the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University. We have also Rebecca Hanson. Rebecca Hanson is an assistant professor at the Department of Sociology and Criminology and Law, and the Center for Latin American Studies, and director of University of Florida's International Ethnography Lab at the University of Florida. And we have David Smilde, who is the Charles A. and Leo M. Favord Professor of Human Relations at Tulane University, and of course, a senior fellow at the Washington Office in Latin America, so somebody from the house. So how this will work is that our panelists will make an overview of the book, and then we'll have two different rounds of questions that we have previously prepared for our panelists, and then we'll open up for a Q&A to engage with the audience, which I always think it's a more fun part. So whenever you want, go ahead.
You. Okay, so I'm going to start, and it's really just a pleasure to be here. It's really almost like a dream come true in the sense that this book, the ideas here really started at WOLA, started on the blog, the WOLA blog that Rebecca and I, with another student, started in 2012, in July 2012. And one of the main issues that we worked on in the first 5 years or so was precisely the issue of citizen security, was violence. You know? And in fact, our chapter, Becca's chapter, and my chapter in the book is actually 3 blog pieces, much developed and amplified, but three blogs that we first published on the WOLA blog. And as well, the ideas of the introduction were all developed here with colleagues here at WOLA. In fact, I think the very first time I talked about a paradox of violence in Venezuela was here in 2012. Presenting in when we had the other conference room. So it's really exciting to be here with the book finished and be able to sort of come back for this presentation. Okay, so can you, next slide. First, just a little bit about this project. Now, this project we took on originally, Verónica and I started talking about this project in 2015, that we had to do this book. And there was a couple of reasons behind that. One was because this issue was really important. No, violence at the time was just skyrocketing, but it was also this moment, you know, Venezuela, anybody who works in Venezuela knows that there's a real serious issue of polarization. And that's not just true of the media or politics, it's also true of scholarship. So there's many issues you want to talk about. You want to have a conference about democracy or about state structures. You're either going to get pro-government scholars or anti-government opposition scholars. And it's really hard to get them to talk to each other, in a civil way. But that at this time had changed quite a bit in one area, and that was the issue of violence, of citizen security. This was an area, and I think in large part because of Verónica's efforts, that there were pro-government and anti-government people that worked together. There was a whole panoply of political positions that nevertheless people were working together, doing ethnographies together, discussing together, and in good part working in Racine with Verónica. And so that was one of the reasons that we decided we should really do this. We should highlight that you can do scholarship across the political spectrum in Venezuela. Another goal that we had with this project is there's a lot of what we call Latin American studies in the U.S. Academy, and that usually amounts to people from the United States studying Latin America and then like discussing amongst themselves, publishing, about, say, Venezuela. So you have gringo scholars publishing about Venezuela. I'm one of those people, And so, but it can be a little bit twisted, a little bit strange, because there's this whole world of scholarship in places like Venezuela, Brazil, and Latin America, in which people publish and cite each other. But it's oftentimes it's very sort of sealed off from the North American Academy. And so we really, really wanted to get beyond that. We wanted to, have this space in which we had Venezuelan scholars talking about Venezuela with Venezuela experts from the outside. And so we tried to have as many Venezuelans as international scholars. In fact, we ended up with more Venezuelan scholars in the final text than international scholars. And of course, that requires patience and resources, because you have to fly everybody up. You have to provide translation. We had to translate a bunch of these chapters. There's also, it's not just translating language, it's also different styles, different academic styles, different expository styles. And in the US, there's a certain sort of pattern, the way scholars write. It's much more sort of positivistic and sort of objective, and literature review, and then data, then analysis. Whereas some of these scholars are leading, for example, criminologists, and they just have a very different way of writing. It's much more sort of expository and sort of like an essay with an essay that leads to a point at the end. So we had to work on issues of style as well. We had our first meeting in October 2015 at Tulane, and then we had another meeting a year and a half later in Caracas, and then there were several LASA panels on this over the years that we also participated in, and of course then also by email. So okay, next slide, please. And so let me just explain what this is. This book is not a research project in the sense that we all got together, got some funding, and did research together and worked on it. I mean, that's one way of doing things. That's a really great thing. What this is a bunch of scholars that all have their own lines of research that have been working and have their conclusions, and we present and have presented in a series of meetings and conferences, and we discuss. And what we try to do with this book is sort of develop a conceptualization. We really tried to write this as a book, not just as an edited volume with a bunch of different opinions. We try to talk and analyze, convince and argue and fight and debate, until we came up with a conceptualization. But it's a conceptualization that sort of does justice to the diversity of texts that are part of it, but it's very much sort of a stepping stone. It's like a momentary taking inventory. It's what we can gather from these, but very much this is, we see this as a stepping stone, and this has sort of developed our point of departure for new projects. Slide. Okay, so this, the name paradox is sort of what sort of most marks this book. And this is the paradox that we start with. This is, you can't see it, this blue is the poverty line, and this, you can kind of forget this blip, because that was the political conflict from 2003, 2004, in which there was a general strike, so poverty went up. And just kind of think about the trend line from 1998 to 2012. During that time, the Chávez government almost halved poverty, and we, in the book, actually, we don't have it here, but we have the Gini coefficient as well. And that likewise goes down significantly. At the same time, violence goes up, and this ends at 2012, it continues up here in 2015, it ends up almost above 70, So one of the highest rates of violence ever recorded outside of a war situation. And so this is the paradox that we begin with, because what most people in Venezuela, in the United States, in fact, everywhere, tend to think with violence is that it is a phenomenon that comes from poverty and inequality. People experience relative deprivation. They experience deprivation compared to people around them. They experience frustration, and so they act out upon it. That's our basic sort of default way of thinking about, and this is really true, left or right. Our way of thinking about violence. But this data absolutely contradicts this. It was evident in Venezuela at the time that there was something very, very different than this standard notion going on. And so in the book, we develop all kinds of alternative explanations and sort of discount those. But let me just go to kind of what we think is going on. Next. Okay, so this is our this is our starting point, and this is what makes our text a bit different from most of what, say, journalists or commentators or everyday people would think about violence. So in our view, and we all work from what would be called relational sociology, a type of sociology that prioritizes sort of social relations and social context, micro context, macro context. So in this perspective, violence results not from frustrated needs, not from a lack of norm and values, no, and not from a lack and inability to control emotions, and not from biographical trauma. No, that's the way that most people think about violence. Rather, we see it as an embodied practice that actors use to maintain or contest dominance in social relations. It's a rational practice. It is something that people do, which is not to say that's a good, but that's the way that you want to understand it. No? And so that's our sort of sociological perspective. And how we think about this in Venezuela is that in Venezuela, during Chavismo, social structures and public institutions provided opportunities for rent seeking, both because of all of the resources coming in the state, provided all kinds of opportunities for, graft, for, people with profits or goods that could be stolen and funneled into illicit markets, as well as, the entry of drugs and other illicit markets. It did not offer means for resolution of conflict, and Venezuela was characterized by impunity, and this made violence common. If you add to that the wide availability of guns during this period, this violence became increasingly lethal. No, so it's one thing if you have violence, but violence that's just fisticuffs is something very different than if you have a gun. No, it becomes something socially very, very different. And Verónica is going to be talking about that next. And so here is and I'm going to end with this slide, just kind of briefly summarizing this, and then Verónica and Rebecca are going to continue on. But so our framework basically looks at, says that throughout the region, this period, because it wasn't just Venezuela, it was, throughout the region, the violence soared. In Venezuela, more than other places, but throughout the region, violence was a huge issue. And so there are a couple of factors that are common throughout the region. One is illicit economies, the growth of the drug economy during this period, and the growth of the availability of guns. But what was unique about Venezuela is four factors. One is the hypertrophic state. So we have a chapter that shows something that's, really sort of boils down the paradox, that it shows that an economist named Josefina Brunicelli has a chapter that shows that from 1971 to 2011, there's this incredible correlation between oil income and violence. The higher the oil income, the higher the violence. And basically she shows that this has to do basically with impunity. When you have this state that's really well-funded, state with all kinds of resources that's expanding, it just doesn't engage, it doesn't enforce social control. It allows a lot of impunity, and that's what we think causes violence. You can add to this revolutionary governance. The fact that during the Chavez period, they did not have the idea that, we're going to build a big bureaucratic, what we sociologists would call a Weberian state. No, rather it was like a big social movement, what scholars for example, the Soviet Union have called a mobilization state. So you use the employees to mobilize for political reasons. You don't really think in terms of bureaucracy or stable routines, transparency. All of those things are considered sort of bourgeois. And instead you see the state as like this big action-oriented sort of mass of people. That also works very much against solidity of institutions. Thirdly, a concentrated disadvantage. Becca's going to talk a bit about this, but I'll just say that, what we show overall is that poverty is not directly related with violence. It's inversely related, but those are national figures. What we did find, and what you see in ethnographies, that there were real pockets of violence. And that's because, during Chavismo, social policies and a lot of the policy of the state were not universalistic. They tended to be policies that, focus on certain segments or certain sectors, certain areas, and so you would oftentimes have people that just were not at all covered or benefited. And so you did end up with these inequalities that provide, and the way we can see it provides opportunities for crime, not necessarily that leads to frustration, but it provides opportunities when you're poor and someone else has resources, that provides an opportunity for crime. And then there's failed policing, which Rebecca will also talk about. Police, the first 6 to 8 years of Chavismo, they did not care about policing. They thought if we just drive down poverty and inequality, we're gonna, there's not gonna be any more problems with violence. And they found out that that was not true. It was exactly the opposite. And then, took on a police reform that Becca will talk about. And so all of this led to soaring levels of violence that we saw. Okay. No, Verónica. Yeah.
Yes. Well, so one important factor in our explanation are guns. So in my chapter, I concentrated in guns. For instance, Sienna, can you just, for instance, guns are present in 90% of the homicides in Venezuela. That is a very high proportion if you compared it with El Salvador, for instance, that has also very high rates of homicides. In El Salvador, guns are present in 70% of the homicides. So something was happening in Venezuela related to guns. I love to present this image because symbolically it's not very common to find a virgin with a gun. But this expresses this particularity of the presence of guns in Venezuela, such having these two very different symbolical objects associated together with guns. So what we were focusing is trying to zoom and to concentrate in guns as important objects. So I started to get in dialogue theoretically with Bruno Latour in order to start to think about guns as important objects, as objects that could intervene in the course of actions of everyday life. For instance, also, departing from 2002, that was the coup d'etat in Venezuela, Chávez began to say that the Venezuelan revolution was a pacific but armed revolution. And indeed, there was, starting for 2004, there was an important increase in guns imports to Venezuela. And we know that guns circulate from legal sources to illicit markets. So guns are there intervening in everyday life. So also what I do in my chapter is to link the wider history of the Venezuelan Revolution with subjectivities and local histories. So in this barrio, in this ethnography that you can, what I do is to concentrate in how guns transform everyday life in communities. For instance, guns in the narratives of the people we interviewed are there marking turning points in the history of the community. For instance, the people say sometimes they don't remember specific events, but they do associate events with the killing of somebody with a gun. Or, well, before in the barrio, it was fun when two guys were confronting each other, but once there was a gun, it was fatal. It was tragic. So the idea was to trace how these important objects that have a specific script to kill, how do they transform local lives and people's histories. Also doing interviews with young men that form part of the gang, guns are definitely there transforming their life stories and subjectivities. For instance, once they started to get in touch with guns, their lives changed. And again, it is a turning point. And for instance, guns are not only important to instrumental projects such as taking revenge or stealing, but they are also objects that open up new experiences and adventures. For instance, young men said, well, but once you've got a gun, your mentality changes and you seek for adventure. So guns, what was important is how guns transforms subjectivities, and they are there to open up new experiences, horizons, such as having fun. So I will leave it there so Becca can continue.
Yeah. Yeah, so David mentioned really quickly, this is our fourth factor, and it's kind of two sides of the same coin, which is thinking about the ways in which first the Chávez government and then Maduro's government approached issues of policing and insecurity. So as David mentioned, the first basic kind of 6 years of Chávez being in office, he really policing just kind of continued the way that it always had, due to this belief that if we reduce poverty and inequality, and that will reduce crime and violence. But then around 2006, there were a couple of very public cases of both former and active police officers that were participating in homicides and kidnappings and certain types of crimes that were just bringing a lot of attention to the police. So the government puts together a commission, a relatively kind of diverse commission of academics, politicians from like diverse parties, policymakers, to kind of think about, to first produce what ended up being a very systematic and incredibly overwhelming study of policing in the country. And policing in the country is really difficult, it's very difficult to get a handle on, because depending on the source you look at, there's at least between 123 to 140 police forces in the country, so municipal, state, and national police forces. And so what the commission really tried to do was say, what do we actually know about how policing is done in the country now, and how can we improve it? So the reform is actually a really interesting case of one of the other factors that David mentioned, which is revolutionary governance. So one of the things that we're really interested in with that concept is not just focusing on conflict between Chavismo and the opposition, because that has received a lot of attention, but really kind of thinking about how the diverse factions within Chavismo actually produced an inability to implement effective policies. And so what happened with police reform initially is that the report was produced, and then there was kind of a year-long period where everything was put on hold because the Minister of Justice at the time was very much so against reform. He felt the police reform was a right-wing project and basically kind of just wanted to push it away, to move it out of the spotlight. He's replaced a year later. Reform gets back on track, and really leads this very ambitious, and I think it was a very interesting, so this is what I initially was looking at for my dissertation, a really progressive police reform, which was led by human rights activists who had been working in Venezuela for decades against police violence. So it's an interesting case in that Chavez is, of course, most often profiled and understood as a military man, but he supports this police reform, that the main goal of the reform was to get the police get the military out of policing, right? And so the reform has about between really 2008 and 2013, and seems to really be gaining some steam, makes some interesting progress. It's very much emphasizes human rights, progressive model of use of force, all of these things, but then dies with Chavez, basically, because he's really the only important political actor that's really supportive of police reform. So once Chavez dies, the reform kind of dies with him. Next slide. And so what happens after this, it wasn't an immediate change as soon as Maduro became president, but by about 2014, he kind of starts to replace. One of the things that the police reform had done was to say that if any high-ranking officer in a security institution should have a police background, should not have a military background. So what you start to see in 2014 are these civilians being replaced by military officers, so kind of a move back to the past, because this is not something that was new with Chavez, of course. Like, military officers for a long period of time had controlled and dominated security institutions. And so what we talk about in the book, and what I work on kind of my broader research is thinking about, the ways in which Maduro took what had been longstanding policing practices run by the military, violent, very violent, not respectful of human rights, right, or due process and things like that. And so how his government and the Ministry of Justice really drew on these practices that had been around for a number of decades, but kind of changed the logic behind them. And so one of the things that Verónica and I have worked on in the past few years is thinking about a move from what we call carceral punitivism to the ways in which the government's policies increased mass incarceration in the country for a number of years. And then what we argue in chapters of our book and in other places is that by 2015, you start to see a move towards what we call systematic killing. So the types of policing that were the goals of police raids at this point are to incarcerate, but also very much so to kill, to wipe out, to eliminate. And this is the way that both the president, the Minister of Justice, and definitely police officers that we interviewed talked about. And they use words like eliminate, liquidate, basically get rid of, wipe off the face of the earth. And there are these two plans that are really indicative of this move that we talk about in a couple of different pieces. So the first was in 2015, Operación de Liberación del Pueblo. And in 2017, the OLP starts to kind of be phased out. And you have las Fuerzas de Acción Especiales that were created within the National Police Force. And so these are different types of plans. We can talk about them more in Q&A if people are interested. But they're both very much so oriented around this idea that comes out of interview work that I've done with police officers. They talk about a green light to kill, basically. So given what they refer to as a green light to kill by the Ministry of Justice, basically kind of with the understanding that there's lots of you'll be protected, basically, if you're engaged in one of these units or one of these raids. And so what these raids kind of basically consist of, as you can see, is just lots of military and police officers coming into a barrio in trucks on motorcycles with large weapons, like military grade weapons, right? Usually very early in the morning, getting people, pulling people out of their homes, arresting them or killing them. And there's a lot of, there are human rights reports and things like that that have been produced, and also work that we've done talking about the degree of robbery that took place during these raids. So people talk about, refrigerators, clothes, money, cell phones, all these things being taken by police officers. They're like memes that started to pop up in Venezuela of hide your dirty laundry before these raids happen, because they're literally take everything. And so, this is kind of this factor of thinking about how was policing kind of remade under Chavismo, both under Chávez and Maduro. So you have this certain period of time with a really very interesting police reform that then dies and then kind of catalyzes to both a return to and an intensification or an ultra militarization of the police. Good, next slide. So the impacts of these raids are very noticeable if you look at the number of people who start to be killed by the police after 2015. So it's the case that the police in Venezuela have become increasingly violent since the late 1990s, well, actually since the 1980s. But there's just a massive spike after 2015, after the implementation of the OLP, and then continuing on with the vice. Such that the Venezuelan police forces become the most violent in the region, which historically has kind of been Brazil's. Brazil has kind of had that claim to fame for a long period of time. But Venezuela, after 2015, police forces there become the most violent in the region. So you can kind of really see the real world kind of impacts of this transition of the logic that we talk about, this move towards systematic killing. One important thing to note here is that, but due to the way that I think media coverage has talked about this issue, as well as some NGOs, there's been an assumption that this massive increase in killings has been largely politically motivated, and that's not the case at all. So there's, of course, political persecution in Venezuela, but the large majority of people who are being killed by these raids are poor men in the barrio. So between the ages of 15 and 25 or 28, with low levels of education, unemployed or employed in the informal sector, so that they account for anywhere between 95 to 98% of deaths each year. So this is another kind of interesting contradiction of the Bolivarian Revolution, that the sector that largely supported Chavismo, right, and was very much so kind of put forward as the face of Chavismo, or it's a sector that's really being hit the hardest by police violence. So if you go to the next slide. So because this was a very long-term process, we started talking about the book in 2015, and it came out in 2022, I believe. The phenomenon that we were studying changed over that period of time. And so we started the book with this first paradox of less poverty, less inequality, more violence. And what you actually end up seeing after 2016 onward is that violent deaths actually start to decrease as poverty and inequality increase. So we kind of have the inverse relationship going on. And so we end the book kind of thinking about why is it that violence, particularly violent crime, is on the decrease. And so, of course, the government would like to say that the police raids and their security plans that have effectively contributed to a reduction in violence. If you go to the next slide, what we argue in the book, we actually point to some of the, if you can go down a couple more, because there'll be some, yeah, there we go. So what we actually argue is that the way that policing has been done since 2015 has had an impact on violent crime, but not for the reasons that the Venezuelan government kind of would like for people to believe. Instead, rather than thinking about these raids as like, eliminating and wiping out criminal groups, which they did in some places, but to a large degree, really, they reorganized the way that criminal actors, the armed actors operated. It increased certain criminal organizations' capacity to control territory. And then really starting in 2013, and then off and on and then starting again in 2017, the government starts to negotiate with some of these organizations that have become much more powerful, much better articulated than they were in the past. I mean, historically, gangs in Venezuela have just been incredibly small and poorly organized. And so basically what we're thinking about is like these raids contributed to an increasing capacity on the state of criminal actors to be able to control territory, which the government then kind of takes advantage of by saying, we can negotiate with these actors now to be able to convince them to reduce the amount of violence that they're utilizing, for example, during certain periods of time to maintain some level of stability. I think that is it. I think that's the end of our presentation. So thank you. Unless I forgot something.
Yeah, so I think that in the interest of time, I'm going to kind of join the questions from the two rounds. And I think that we can do this backwards. So I'm going to start with Rebecca and then move back from there. And I think it would be interesting. You kind of already explained the paradox, although I think it's interesting to see how police violence, even though there isn't a relationship between violence and poverty, at the same time, police violence has affected in a differentiated way the poor sector of society. So I think it would be interesting if maybe you can explain this a little bit, and how, because for example, the OLP, Operación Liberación del Pueblo, was not done in the most privileged areas of the city. So I think that would be interesting. And the other thing is, how have security institutions been remade under the Maduro government? How has it changed from Chávez to Maduro?
So to be clear on the first question, is it kind of thinking about what's the relationship between violence, poverty, and kind of policing?
Yeah, the impact that it has, because even though there's no correlation, or that's the paradox, right, that the book tries to explain, it does have an impact, or police violence does have an impact
in popular sectors.
Yeah.
So I mean, one of the things we talk about in the book, or try to think about, we're not trying to say that there is no relationship between poverty and violence, or poverty and crime, right? We do think that there is a relationship. What we're trying to do is kind of contextualize what that relationship looks like, and say it's not necessarily as direct maybe as scholarship, and I think even kind of common sense would tell us. So it's really kind of thinking about under what conditions might poverty lead to violence. And so that's one of the reasons why this idea of concentrated disadvantage is interesting for us, because one, it points to some of the weaknesses of the way that Chávez's policies went about reducing poverty and inequality. So if you look at why poverty and inequality decreased during this time period, it tends to be because of an investment in social services, which are very important, of course, and also access to consumer goods. So people were able to purchase items that in the past they weren't able to purchase. So that does reduce poverty and inequality, but not in a way that addresses structural drivers of poverty and inequality, right? And so it's not a long-term fix, right? And so this is kind of what David was mentioning as well, right? Because of the uneven nature of access to these services and access to goods and things like that, you actually see places where conflict is increasing between groups, between individuals, and between armed actors. And so because you have this continuing increase in interpersonal violence, continuing increase in gang violence, the government then uses that to justify these very kind of violent police interventions. I think kind of with the idea that, we tried the kind of social welfare approach to dealing with violence and crime, that did not work. And so now we're going to try a very kind of different approach to violence. And so, yeah, I think one of the things that's really interesting to think about, and something I'm working on a little bit more in the book that I just finished, is thinking about how state policy, and there's a lot of really interesting literature on this in Latin America, but kind of thinking about how state policy has contributed to increasing violence by reworking illicit networks, for example, like how policing directly contributes to this issue of violence that we kind of start looking at in the beginning of the book. I don't know if that answered your question. But then in terms of thinking about kind of how state security institutions have been remade under Maduro, it's like a huge topic. It's a very important question, though. I mean, I think one of the most important things to kind of think about is the ways in which Maduro's government has facilitated and promoted impunity among police officers. And that's something that's very difficult, almost impossible to roll back once it's been implemented. And so once you highly militarize the police and provide them with kind of like a green light to engage in egregious human rights violations, and then so what's happened in the past few years, the fights really no longer exist. They kind of do on paper, but they don't really operate very much anymore. What happened is, because there was a lot of criticism, a lot of international highlighting of violation of human rights, officers from those units were kind of divided up and sent out into different parts of the national police. And so now we basically kind of had this dispersion of violent actors across different policing groups, which then makes it very, very difficult again to even kind of identify who these violent actors are and remove them from the police drive and kind of remove the effect you could kind of think about it as like a contamination effect that has across the different kind of units that they've been sent to. So I would say, I think just this kind of like general understanding of impunity and protection of the violation of human rights. And the other thing that I'll just end on is that I think, contrary to what a lot of people think about security forces in Venezuela, because I think the main security force that kind of tends to be talked about now is the SEBIN, which is the political police. But my perspective on one of the main ways in which Chavismo has remade the security landscape in Venezuela is it's become incredibly chaotic, incredibly uncoordinated. So it's not this like authoritarian state that has like this one very strong police force that has been able to penetrate and supervise society effectively or efficiently. Instead, I mean, what I at least I could see with my research is you have increasing conflict between state institutions, between police institutions. So you have increasing conflict, lack of coordination, lots of chaos that kind of has characterized the entire security landscape. So rather than like more coordination and more effective or efficient policing, you have kind of the opposite.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting. And yes, it was the UN fact-finding mission established by the Human Rights Council had criticized the FIS. And then what the latest report says is that they created the DAED, which is basically the same.
Which is one of the places they got sent to. Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so I would like to move on to Verónica. And I would like for you to address at least two things. First is how have political ideologies influenced violence in Venezuela? And the other aspect is, in your expert opinion, what strategies could be implemented to reduce crime and violence in Venezuela? I think that now we've heard a lot in the last weeks and months about the possibility of a democratic transition in Venezuela, and security is one of the issues that will need to be addressed. So if you could tell us a little bit.
So the first question, I will say that and we work and we focus in our book about revolutionary governance. So I will say that during the 90s, Venezuela had comparable homicide rates, such as Brazil. We had like 20 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. But then during Chavismo, our homicide rates were compared to those of El Salvador, 50 homicide per 100,000. 50 per 100,000 inhabitants. So we had as well similar problems such as Brazil, structural inequality, drug trafficking, proliferation of guns. But what we concentrate in the book is the impact of these four factors, and specifically with the idea of revolutionary governance. We touch what Becca was saying about the internal inability to coordinate. For instance, to give you an idea, during 1999 and 2018, we had 15 ministers of justice. And for instance, Pedro Carreño, that he was the minister after a minister that developed the police reform. He said that the police reform was from the right. And then we say in Spanish, la engavetó. This means like he threw it away or he put it in a box. So, and then I wouldn't say it's ideology per se, but the internal dynamics that we were having in the same of the state. All this also revolutionary governance has to do with the disposition of the state to associate with non-state armed actors, such as colectivos. So there are these willingness of the state to associate with other armed actors. Another difference that we are experiencing in Venezuela is this diffumination of violence. Before we had violence was concentrated, was urban violence. Violence was concentrated in Caracas, in Valencia, in Maracaibo. After, we had different poles of violence, such as the frontier with Colombia or the northern east frontier with the Caribbean. So there is also this transformation of violence and this presence of organized actors in Venezuela. Well, concerning the second question, it's a difficult question. And nowadays, it's a problematic question thinking about Bukele and how the mano dura model is becoming so popular. We see that Ecuador President Rafael Noboa is now saying that he will put into place the Bukele model. But we know that the Bukele model is a conjunctural. I mean, what we are seeing is a temporary decrease. I think it is so predictable that we will see a transformation of violence in 2 or 3 years. You can imagine having 2% of the population put into jail, all the suffering and all. If you multiply this 2% for all the families they have, this is an enormous network of people that are suffering. So, of course, one of the main, the problem with these measures is that they take time. And politicians want quick results, especially if they are in electoral conjunctures, moments. But of course, of course, it is very important to tackle in the region the structural inequalities. So in Venezuela, we had this decrease of poverty, but it was in terms of the money people were having, not the structural conditions of inequality. So one thing very important is to tackle structural inequalities. Another thing that is fundamental is to to have policies that are specifically focused on young men in poor neighborhoods. I mean, youth are absolutely forgotten in our region. And of course, the only networks that absorb them are the illicit networks. So that is very important to tackle.
And young men, I mean,
Young men, of
with a
course.
gender element.
Of course, of
Yeah, it's
course.
interesting thing about the way that Chavez policies operated, which we talk about a little bit in the book, is that they largely affected women. I mean, young men from excluded sectors were kind of not actively excluded, but they just didn't benefit in the same way that women.
Exactly. Like you had these massive social policies such as the misiones. There were misiones for everyone, like for the mothers, for the children, but young men were the orphanlands of civil society and the state. So, well, of course, police reform in our country will be fundamental, and police reform and justice within the police institution like this. This is Guillermo Trejo's work that help us to think how this important message of not accepting human rights violations, it is very important. I think in Venezuela, what we were speaking yesterday, we have to tackle reparation processes for victims, and that is very important. Symbolic reparations, but material reparations. When we talk with the women, they always say, "I want the name of my son to be
Clean.
exactly clean, like to how do you say, to clean the name of my son." So symbolic reparations are also very important, and I will leave it here.
Yeah, we have a little bit more of time for David, and then we'll go because we already have some questions on the chat. So I would just go with one question for you because I think you already responded the other one. And it's in the book you discuss how the Venezuelan government didn't pay for the political cost of violence, which is one of the reasons why they were able to continue to perpetrate crime and to create this relationship also with crime structures in Venezuela. So what are the implications of this in the erosion of governance, of the rule of law, and of social cohesion in Venezuela?
Yeah, and this is a really central element of the Venezuelan story, and it kind of starts here in that this is one of the first things. I actually just found my presentation from 2012 here at WOLA talking about this issue because this was one of the first things that we noticed. There was this huge spike in violence, but Chavez didn't pay a consequence for this. His popularity stayed strong, and so if you look at opinion polls, there's a comment like data analysis will ask people, what is your primary concern right now? And when crime and insecurity was the highest, Chavez was still very popular. When inflation was high, Chavez would pay a price, So worries with inflation and Chavez's popularity would be inversely related.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas worries about crime and violence and Chavez's popularity were not related at all. No, they would just kind of vary independently. And so, for example, in May 2009, I helped the Centro Gomilla write a question and put it on a data analysis poll that asked, about this and asked, could a different president solve the problem of crime and violence? And 59, almost 60% said the problem of violence is so difficult that no president could solve it. And so that was a really big obstacle and that's one of the reasons it took so long for the government to actually take up this issue, is that they didn't pay a political price for it. And so by the time Chavez takes up this issue, it's really just because there are some activists that convince him that this is a really important issue, that it's not a bourgeois right-wing issue, that part of socialism is to try and, provide security. And he listens to them. And so 2008, 2009, they adopt this police reform. But throughout the period of police reform, this is still a problem because in our Becca and I's chapter is based on some questions that we put on a couple years later on an omnibus poll of depth analysis. And, asking people, well, what is the cause of crime and violence? And people will say, the overwhelming answer is the loss of values, the loss of values. Of course, that doesn't work at all if you try to correlate it, because rise in crime doesn't have anything to do with values, but that's the way people tend to think about it. And so then we asked questions, asked people, in two different ways. First of all, what do you think about Hugo Chávez's police reform? And the people that said, oh, it's really good, Chávez supporters basically from the popular sectors. People who said, oh no, it's terrible, were government opponents from the upper middle class, more educated sectors. But we also asked, without even mentioning Chávez, just said, do you support human rights training and the training in the progressive and differential use of force for police officers, which is just standard police reform? And there, it was people that are more aligned with the opposition that said, yes, we support that. And people that were, more Chavista said no, and we go into some reasons why. But what that meant is that, there was no natural constituency for police reform, because people thought, the people that were most open to sort of a human rights discourse about security tended to be opposition supporters, not Chavista supporters. But then the opponents, if they knew it was Hugo Chávez's police reform, instead of thinking about the content, well, then they opposed it. Whereas the people in the popular class supported it. And so that was something that really just left us police reform at a certain point without a constituency, without a firm base. And it was one of the reasons it was so easy for Maduro to undermine, and because this is, common sense is a very poor guide to security policy. So Maduro's opprobrious, horrendous policies with these OLP, these militarized policing initiatives, have been the most popular things he's done as a president over the past 10 years. Right? I think it's the only initiative for COVID, he was over 50%, but these are policies that have consistently been over 50%. It might be down a little bit lower now, but and so it's the most popular thing because people, if you're a victim of crime, that's what you like to see, a mano dura, and it's something that impacts throughout the region. It's emotionally sort of satisfying. And you think that's what you just need to fight violence with violence. That's going to take care of it. But, it doesn't work that way. And so, what we've seen in Venezuela, and Becca mentioned at the end, is that this mano dura has sort of apparently worked in the sense that crime has gone down, and the Maduro government, of course, says, look, at our policies are actually working. And to a certain effect, in a certain sense, they do work, in the sense that what they've done is they've basically made, as Becca said, gangs organized. So instead of disorganized violence, and of course, violence, if you see violence as a way of gaining dominance in social relations, of course, it's going to be more in common when social relations are in flux. So where Venezuela used to be 10 years ago is they had all kinds of small gangs. I remember writing any number of times, like, well, at least Venezuela doesn't have gangs, and so have these little small groups in neighborhoods of 3, 4, 5, 10 people that would control the illicit market there for drugs or whatever. And so you had a lot of contestation between these different groups. And so what happens when you have these big operations that come in, they're extremely violent, that can make violence increase temporarily as they kill and jail people. That leaves a vacuum that then gets taken up by new gangs. So there's new sort of the illicit, the sort of violent market has to settle. But then once it settles, and they have in mind that this is the new normal, these militarized police initiatives, well, they suddenly have much more incentive to organize. So you get these big mega bandas, and which can drive. You get to move from disorganized violence to organized violence, that'll drive violence down. But it also makes violence much more organized and durable, and gets it more involved and more organized, more involved in illicit markets. Oftentimes gives it political aspirations. And so then you will see these big outbreaks of violence like we had in 2021, who was it? El Coqui. Yeah, El Coqui, and you guys have written about this. That basically shut down for several days the western part of Caracas. It's something you would never have imagined 10, 15 years ago. And so, this sort of, the reason Chávez didn't pay for political costs for violence is because of people's common sense. That's a very poor guide to security policy. But that's still a very fundamental impact. I mean, we know how popular Bukele is, no? And it's not just because he's driven down violence, it's because people like that kind of policy. And it's a really, really fundamental challenge throughout the region is how you can sell people police reform that's based on human rights, that's based on effectiveness, that's based on reform of justice and corrections, so that you can have an actual sustainably safe society. That's a huge challenge. And I think a lot of it has to do, with your standard attitudes towards violence.
I think it's really interesting because it also puts us in context of what's happening in the region and what could potentially happen, even if there's a transition of power in Venezuela and the risk of, for example, a Bukele model being more popular, like we're seeing, for example, in Ecuador. So I would just like to take a round of questions from the audience. We have 3 questions online, so maybe I'll take one online first and maybe 2 in person. If somebody has questions here, you can take notes of them and we can do a second round if that's okay. So anyone here? Start. Okay, let's start then with the ones online. So the first question is, where are the guns coming from? Who is the supplier of guns for the Venezuelan government? Which I think it's really interesting. We have then a comment from another scholar, Magali Sanchez, who says, in the opinion of the authors, how did the zonas de paz and the transformations that occurred after the impact radicalized groups and later on the violent killings of young population in barrios by state forces? Then we have another comment that says, congratulations for this very interesting and insightful discussion. My question aims to better understand relation sociology. Can the paradox in Venezuela be better explained through government-related factors, such as the monopoly of violent means by state and non-state actors, or through social factors, such as the perception of valuable things like money, justice, and status within Venezuelan society, as suggested by deprivation theory? Sorry if my question is too great. Thank you.
One of the questions too what?
Too nerdy.
Right.
So we have like 3 of those 3 questions to start, and then we can open up for more.
Do you want to take the guns question?
Yes, well, in our chapter, we focus on small guns because they are the ones that people have. So what Jose Luis Fernandez showed in his chapter 2, but it is legal imports of guns. So we were in the Presidential Commission of Gun Controls and Ammunitions. But what Jose Luis did was we didn't have the sources of the government, but he went to the sources of the exports of guns. So at that moment, just to summarize, it was mostly legal small guns what we were concentrating into. And then with the zonas de paz, Becca can also talk about that because her chapter is concentrated on that. But I can say that zonas de paz helped to organize the gangs. And in the for instance, in Caracas, where these zonas de paz, for those who doesn't know, it's a policy that was driven by Vice Minister of Justice. And I have the feeling that he got inspired of the zonas de paz of El Salvador. Because he took the same vocabulary of at the beginning, territory freeze of violence, and then he started to talk about zonas de paz. And this policy was developed in 2013. But in 2017, what we see in Caracas is Zonas de Paz 2, that was then this agreement between the Maduro government with this now very important organized gang. So it was a time where in 2017, the political struggles were in the streets and massive protests. So there was this new Zonas de Paz or Zonas de Paz 2, and the agreement was that police forces were not going to enter into this territory, but the gang would have to be responsible of controlling population and territory. And of course, this helped to establish a very institutionalized criminal governance. It was very clear that the gang was responsible for providing services, for resolution of conflicts among neighbors. Even it was fascinating to see how people refer the gang using the bureaucratic metaphors. Like they were saying, well, the coqui is like the minister. He distributes services and favors to people. Or they are like the judges or like the tribunals. They are the one, if your husband beat you, you denounce your husband in front of the gang. You don't go to the official authorities. So definitely in Caracas, Zonas de Paz was the institutionalization of a very important criminal governance. Thank you, Magali, for your question.
Just on the point about guns, if you talk to both police officers and gang members, they'll both say that gang members get their guns from either the police or the National Guard. It's really the only place that so weapons come in through the legal market, through the illicit market, and then get filtered out into the black market through state forces. So it's another kind of
ammunitions too.
And ammunition as well, yeah. And so it's another kind of one of these interesting cases of like looking at revolutionary governance, these like conflicts within the government, because at the same time that you have people really pushing for disarmament law, and there was some progress on that front, even though the law ended up being very watered down, but there was some progress in terms of disarmament and controls of ammunitions that ended up being, I think, approved in 2014. But years before that, Venezuela became the second largest purchaser of guns in the region. So you have like these moves within Chavismo that are trying to really limit access to guns. At the same time, the government really massively increases the number of weapons they're purchasing. And if the state is the one that people are getting weapons from, if you see an increase in state purchasing of weapons, that's going to filter out into the illicit economy, which is what you see in the case of Venezuela. In terms of the Zonas de Paz, I'm not exactly sure I would say that they radicalized gangs or armed actors. What they did is they provided time and resources for gangs to be able to reorganize, largely already having the experience of living with the OLP. So as Veronica kind of mentioned, the idea, one of the kind of negotiations that behind the Zonas de Paz was the idea that the government will transfer credits or some kind of money or something like that to these areas with the goal of gangs turning to some other kind of economic production. So the idea was they could open up businesses, create some other kind of like form of income, right, rather than engaging in illicit activities, but there was no supervision. So in contrast to the case of El Salvador, there was absolutely no supervision or kind of third party supervision of what was happening with the money. So you have this like relatively important large transfer of resources from the state to some areas. And then rather than utilizing those resources to do what the government thought gangs were going to do, they bought weapons with the anticipation that something like an OLP could happen again. And so what the Zona de Paz did is that it gave them time without the police actively monitoring the area, and give them resources to be able to increase kind of firepower, their access to weapons and ammunition. And so this is kind of going back to our idea of like, how do these policies reorganize illicit economies, kind of thinking about how state policies are doing that. And then the Zonas de Paz end up justifying these very violent police raids because now the government can say, well, we have gangs that have really large weapons, they have really like military grade weapons, therefore we have to respond with a very with even larger weapons, right? And so you have this like very like vicious circle of providing gangs the time to be able to kind of reorganize, and then that provides the government an excuse to be able to engage in very, very lethal and violent missions, which then contributes to gangs reorganizing again. So yeah, there's, rather than kind of like radicalizing, I would say there's just like a complete like reorganization, rearticulation.
Okay, so I'll take on the nerdy question of relational sociology. I'm so glad actually that somebody asked.
First time we got that, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. The, you know, so the question was, you know, in terms of relational sociology, what's more important, government related factors or social factors? And I would say both, because, you know, when you talk about relational sociology, it's basically sort of almost like a meta perspective. It's a perspective on a basic theoretical perspective on what you're looking at. And so it works against what we sociologists would call self-action. No, the idea that people act because they have certain dispositions, no, or certain frustrations or certain emotions, no, and you just sort of bracket that and assume that people are rational, no, and then look at how the rationality plays out in microsocial context. And that's the basic idea of relational sociology. So how does this play out here? Yeah, I mean, so this is both the government and social factors are important, but the important issue here is how they're important. So the way the Chavismo has been important is in what we'd call, you know, revolutionary governance. The fact that they did not aim to have the sort of the Weberian, you know, universal bureaucratic state, rather the sort of movement state. They didn't aim at social control, really. They aimed at sort of mobilizing resources. And so what you have is a state actor that did not really have a monopoly of violence, no? And so when you don't have a state actor with a monopoly of violence, well, then you have other people that are going to step in and provide that monopoly, even it's a small monopoly of violence. And so, you know, the state has a huge number of resources, but didn't aim for social control or having really effective monopolies. And so that meant other people took up that slack. In terms of social factors, so to put a point on it, get back to the nerdy question, it's not that people, like was often said, people were imitating Chavez's violent rhetoric, no, or that people were so frustrated about Chavez that they act out, or they were sort of doing what Chavez did. No, it's because of certain elements of that governing project and how it did not sort of provide security that led other people to provide security in a very violent way. No, and the same thing with social factors. No, so we absolutely think that poverty and inequality are important, but not in the way that people normally think. It's not that poverty creates this sort of relative deprivation. People act out to kind of fulfill their needs. And it's not that inequality creates this sort of frustration that's acted out in aggression. Rather that, you know, we think of poverty and, you know, inequality provides opportunity. On the one hand, if somebody is poor and someone else has resources, that is an opportunity for rent seeking. No, that just a rational activity. And it also provides a real difference in state coverage, no, or coverage of state institutions. So it's not that police don't go into audios in Caracas, but when they do, it's not to come in and be an effective presence and keep order. It's usually sporadic, violent entries and exits. No, they'll come in, exercise violence for whatever reason, show who's in charge, and then leave. No, and so that's what you get in poor neighborhoods, and it's one of the reasons that, you know, there's so much more violence in poor neighborhoods. So, I mean, just to think about the different ways of thinking about it, or thinking about this perspective and what concentrated disadvantage means. Concentrated disadvantage is a concept. It's a network concept. It's a concept of social structure. It's not sort of a rebake or a remix of frustration and aggression. So if you can just kind of take a fix or think about a neighborhood in which or a middle-class neighborhood in which there's well-funded schools that kids go to that give them homework and have supervision, that there's families, family authorities that are observing young people, and guiding them. There are neighborhoods that have a degree of trust between neighbors, if there's a crime, if there's something going that they can call and count on each other. I'm sorry.
Employment.
Yeah, and there's after-school programs that say, and there's functioning policing that will actually come when there's a problem. If you compare that and think about what that does to anybody, to the possibilities that I'm going to act in a violent way, compared to that to a context which has dysfunctional schools, that probably have very poor resources, has non-present adults, maybe single parent or non-parent family, kids that hardly have a parental observation, neighborhood in which there's distrust, neighbors don't trust each other and don't trust the authorities, there's violent policing, there's no extracurricular activities. Well, those are all things that are very characteristic of poor neighborhoods, that make poor neighborhoods more violent. But you got to think about it in terms of a network phenomenon, not in terms of social psychological frustration or maladaptation phenomena. People are doing what rational people will do. And anybody who is in a violent context, you pretty quickly learn how to defend yourself, and learn what you need to do to make sure you're not a victim, and so that's what we're trying to do, is get away from the discussion of like maladapted people that have some kind of biographical trauma or problematic emotions or violence, to look at normal people that in a given context are going to choose violence as a way of interacting with each other.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We have a very interesting question here, but I don't know if somebody from here, Jimena. Yeah.
So I'm just curious to understand, which is something that I have a hard time understanding about Venezuela, is how with this sort of criminal governance, why haven't these groups at some point been like, okay, we want to have national aspirations or political aspirations? Why hasn't that happened?
Well, let's take a couple.
Yeah, take a couple.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Rafael. My question is related to the expansion of small gangs in Venezuela to larger criminalized institutions. I'm wondering the role of external actors, for example, transnational criminal organizations in the region, in the Americas, or even states like China, Russia, and Iran, and how they can help facilitate the importation of weapons or other malign influences.
My name is Tejas. My question has to do with zonas de paz, especially because in terms of the agreement where police forces would not enter a region and then the non-state actors would kind of be in charge of, I was actually just today reading Flanagan's piece on service provision for my class, which is how non-state actors would kind of provide services, which obviously is a good thing in the short term, but can create dependency and a lack of legitimacy in the state. So I'm just wondering if that's a bad thing in the long term. And also, just to add on to that, in regards to that paradox between violence and poverty, if these provisions are being provided and poverty in the region is generally going down, why do we see violence increasing when there is an agreement? Is it because, as you said, that would justify violent police raids, or is it like a bigger issue?
Mm-hmm. Do we take this round? We still have some time. Let's take this, and then because there are two questions that I think it would be interesting to read to get to. So if you can keep them shorter.
Yeah, you too. I think take these.
Yes, so Jimena, they don't have political aspirations. They want to continue their activities and rent seeking without problems. That's why all the bribes to the police. But when they start to get organized and they have the zonas de paz, in order to keep the police forces away, they have to start to be responsible for some local dynamics. And that's why they are pushed forward to taking responsibility and protagonism in conflict resolution, for instance. So the idea is to keep the police forces away in order to control the territory. But they become political local actors in the sense where, for instance, Maduro did negotiate with them. So they are like informal political actors. But they don't want to take the state to have, to have a political participation. But in reality, they control territories, they control rents, and they control people. So that's why there is this very passionate debate nowadays about and zonas and paz total in Colombia. I mean, the fact that you have to recognize these guys as real political actors. So this is a whole debate we are having nowadays. So so the idea of gangs and having international support, or not really. I mean, these are gangs that follow the path that you can see with the PCC in Sao Paulo or the Maras in El Salvador.
So not at that level, but yeah, it's similar.
So like massive incarceration, or so there is this process of organization in prison, and then this flux of communication between the prison and the neighborhoods. And every young man knows that he will be put into prison. So it's a sort of a social insurance to be in good shape, in good terms with the gangs inside. So I wouldn't say that the Russians or not at all. And the zonas de paz, I will leave.
Is there another zona de paz question? I mean, so I just have a couple of notes written down. Yeah, I mean, I think gangs are political in that they're interested in the state supporting policies that favor them. So I think there is a way to think about gangs that have no political aspirations. So Benjamin Lessing writes about this a little bit, right? They're like, gangs are interested in lobbying the state to support policies that are in their interest, not because they actually want to control, not because they want to parallel the state or because they want to become the state, but rather they have their own economic and self-interest. And so they do want to influence state policy to the degree that they want to make sure those policies are in their favor. And I think that is what you see largely in the case of Venezuela. In terms of why they don't have larger political aspirations, I think that's a really good conversation to have. I mean, it might be because I think that's something you might see in the future potentially, right? I mean, I think Venezuela has for so long had such small, disorganized gangs that we're really kind of seeing like a transformation happening in a very late stage in comparison to other places in Latin America. So there's a question of, how political their aspirations might become later on. But yeah, I think it's interesting to kind of think about how criminal actors or armed actors kind of like calculating to make sure that the state doesn't interfere with their interests. So we have some interviews with some gang members in Miranda, in a more rural area, talking about the case of COVID and saying, we really cracked down on, people going out because we knew that if people were coming in and out of the barrio a whole lot, then the state would try to come in and control the area. So we wanted to prevent, the state getting, we didn't want to draw a lot of attention to ourselves. So we made sure to enforce COVID quarantines in order to be able to prevent that. I think in terms of transnational gangs, I'm very wary. I think Veronica's absolutely right. This is a very local phenomenon other than thinking about the Colombian case. I mean, there is an important factor there to think about relationships between Colombian armed actors and Venezuelan armed actors. I think we have to be really careful about using the term transnational when we think about the case of Venezuela, because I think that that's getting thrown around a whole lot, and there's not a lot of good evidence to show that armed actors in Venezuela are anyway reaching some kind of transnational. It might be the case. I mean, gang members migrate when other people migrate, right? So it's definitely the case that people who are members of certain gangs migrate elsewhere, and then they get identified other places, and that gets used as evidence to say this is now a transnational gang. So I worry about that because I think it's very stigmatizing towards Venezuelans who have migrated, and it projects a certain image of the degree of organization that gangs have in Venezuela that I just did not think is accurate. And I'll leave it there because I don't want to.
Okay, just two finger here. The Jimenez question, I sort of just jotted down as you asked that question, just wait. No, because as Becca was saying, I mean, it's a relatively new phenomenon. The last 8 to 10 years, you get to this this movement from disorganized to organized. And I think the future you can see in Mexico, you know, with like Guillermo Trejo's work on showing how many of these criminal gangs end up killing like, you know,
Mhm.
political candidates because they know who, you know, who's going to crack down on them and who's not, who's going to facilitate. And so they do what Ben calls violent lobbying. You know?
Mhm.
And so I mean, I think, you know, that could definitely be in the future.
We have 7 minutes left, but there's one particular question that I think it falls right into this, and it's let me see. Okay, given the rampant insecurity and threat to people across political ideology in Venezuela, no, sorry. It's a very long question, so I'll just go to the specific. How did you expect that upcoming elections will develop in the near future, and how fragile do you think the situation is? Could insecurity and political violence affect the upcoming elections? So I'll leave that question, and you had another one.
So my question was actually to piggyback on yours, specifically about the displacement crisis, because, so first of all, I was in Colombia for quite a while last semester, went to Chile for one day without even prompting. Que los venezolanos, que tren de Aragua, right? Like immediately, right? And so whether it is evidence-based or not, Venezuela has gone from being seen as a place that was sort of like this jewel to now not only a dysfunctional place, but an exporter of violence, right? So like it's exporting not only people, but it's exporting violence. And we now see it in the US as well, right? Like with regards to the Venezuelans, like they, you know, that happened recently and things like that. And they're coming, so they're being characterized as that. But specific to the South America context, this conversation around Tren de Aragua being able to control, like in Chile, you know, and it's just like they control everything. And I'm like, no, they don't.
Yeah.
Right? Or like there's 2 million Venezuelans here. And I'm like, no, there aren't. There cannot be 2 million Venezuelans in Chile. But the imaginary is very powerful, and it's definitely impacting not only the stigmatizing perspective, but I wanted to ask, the numbers of Venezuelans who have left has got to impact all of these issues that you're talking about,
Yeah.
including the rent seeking, right? Like, so like when people leave, there's fewer people to extort.
Mhm.
Right? And so I was just curious about, as this displacement crisis goes on, and what's going on with that. And regarding the elections, I just got an update right now on my phone. So Brazil and Colombia both came out with statements about Venezuelan elections today, and the Venezuelan government, the Cancilleria, has already just put out statements calling it election interference on the part of both those governments. Just happened.
Yeah.
Wow, Colombia.
Colombia.
That's a good statement. It's a good statement. So
I'll just respond really quickly to the Tren de Aragua question. Yeah, I mean, like I said, I don't think that there's really good evidence that I think, yeah, it's absolutely the case. I have a student who works in Chilean prisons, and people in prisons talk about, yeah, there's presence of the Aragua here already. I would just answer that really quickly by saying, in terms of thinking about, you know, violence is being driven by self-interest and irrational action, what is one of the easiest ways, if you're a young man going to another country to gain a reputation in a space, is to say, I'm a member of this Tren de Aragua that already has, like, you know, people know it and have an association with it. And so there's an individual incentive or a group incentive to be able to say, we are a branch of the Tren de Aragua, rather than, and no one questions that, right? So it's, I think, like, kind of stepping back and thinking about what are the other incentives that people have to be spreading. So I think it's both the case that politicians spread this idea because it helps to think about, to be able to criminalize and stigmatize populations. But I think, you know, Venezuelan men do as well, in terms of thinking about how, if you land in a space where you have very few networks and very little capital, that's a form of capital that you draw upon, and who's going to challenge you. But I'll leave the other two questions to these guys. Another question.
do you know?
2 minutes.
Yeah, just remember the election.
That's okay.
Well, the elections, oof. Well, two things. Probably we will keep having Maduro on power.
Yeah.
So that won't affect the distribution of power between, that won't destabilize the police forces, or so I guess we will continue in this same situation. I'm not very optimistic, I'm sorry, with what is happening.
But if there were a transition, you would see then.
A lot of disruption.
Yeah.
If there were, of course, I mean, these are Guillermo Trejo's work about Mexico, how, and this is one of the important challenges in Venezuela. What are we going to do with police forces that are so much engaged in illicit traffics and
But criminal actors that depend on the state as well.
Exactly. So definitely, I mean, some destabilization in all these balances are going to be important.
It's very likely that violence
And
will
the
increase.
and
Very likely.
also other armed actors such as colectivos, they are starting to threat that if the opposition wins, they will go to the mountains. So of course, I mean, yeah.
So just answering to these two questions. I mean, one of where we started with this whole project, 10 years ago, was basically with one of the reasons, and another reason I didn't mention, is that there was a tendency to think of this soaring violence in a context of authoritarian government as political violence. And we really wanted to show that, no, it's not political violence in terms of like partisan political violence. No, it's violence in the sense that it's political in the sense that violence is always political, but this is not political violence. This is not violence, the government trying to restrict democracy. No, so that's a different animal. There's some overlap, there's some relevancies there, but we're really kind of talking about criminal violence and instead of political violence. That said, where I think it's most relevant is there's that possibility of disruption, but also, I think there's a very strong possibility if there were a transition in an opposition government, especially, with some candidates more than others, but say Maria Corina, we would very likely see something like Bukele, and we would see something mano dura. That is like the most in vogue security policy in the region. And so it's very possible, and it's extremely popular. So elections are actually not terribly good. No matter what happens, they're not terribly good for security policy. To the issue of the Tren de Agua and migrants and whatnot, I'll just say this. One constant in the past really 20 years in Venezuela is the desire to take issues and make them international. Why is that? Because there's a very acute political conflict that has to do with the government becoming increasingly authoritarian and a population that wants international intervention. And so how do you do that? You want to say to international audiences, it's in your interest to intervene in Venezuela and look at what can happen. And so you do that. So you get stories of Hezbollah, you get stories of nukes, you get stories of missiles. And now the most recent iteration is the Tren de Agua that's, throughout the region and is taking over the continent and has even reached the University of Georgia.
Yeah.
So, which is not to make light of that violence, but you really have to be taken with a grain of salt. I mean, I assume that most studies will show, as they do in most places, that immigrants are actually less likely to commit crime, and I think studies in Colombia have shown, people always think that they're going to take resources, and studies have shown what we always know, that immigrants end up leading to economic growth. And I haven't seen the studies, but I would assume that also show that they're probably less likely to commit crimes. And so there is that context that there's a continual effort to try and internationalize whatever happens in Venezuela, to say that if this is a threat to the Western Hemisphere, so you better intervene.
Yeah, thank you so much for your questions, for this very rich conversation, for your incredibly insightful comments. And I will just finish by asking you to tell our audience where can they get the book?
You can get it on Amazon, read everything. You can also get it straight from the press as well. So
Okay.
probably not going to be in your Barnes and Noble, but you can get it online.
If you know Barnes and Noble.
Just search on the title.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.